Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for being with us. We're going to talk about state government trifectas, one of my favorite topics. A state government trifecta, if you don't know, occurs when one party holds the governorship and majorities in both chambers of the state legislature. Essentially, that means you have full control over your ability to pass legislation. Currently, there are 40 trifectas, 23 Republican and 17 Democratic, with the remaining 10 states having some form of divided government. 11 states are holding gubernatorial elections later this year, and 85 of the country's 99 state legislative chambers will hold elections as well, meaning there's quite a few shuffling that could potentially occur in the balances of power across the country. We recently released one of our regular annual reports on the Trifecta vulnerability ratings, and I'm now joined by one of our team members who led that analysis, Joel Williams. Joel, always good to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
It's July. Summer's almost ending, isn't it? My goodness, where does the year go? So we've talked about trifectas forever. You and I have been working on trifectas together for probably more than a decade now. Why does the trifecta status even matter? What are the implications of having one party control over the three major branches of government? So tell the listeners a little bit about, or viewers, let's talk about trifectas and why they matter.
Yeah, so you touched on it a bit in the intro. It's obviously much easier to pass legislation that your party wants when you have both chambers of the legislature to pass it and a governor to sign it. If there's listeners in like Kentucky or North Carolina, they might recognize their states see a lot of gubernatorial vetoes because they have a Democratic governor and a Republican state legislature. And so, in North Carolina's case, they can kind of get around that with veto overrides. But those require more votes usually than just simple majorities.
Except Kentucky, it's one of the craziest states. They can override that veto with a simple majority. It's one of those rare, unique elements of the state chamber.
Yeah. So, it avoids all the gubernatorial conflict stuff when you have a trifecta. And then, if your legislative chamber are split between parties, which I don't think we have any of those anymore. But those were also a situation where it's just really hard to pass anything. Like at the U.S. level, for instance, at the Iowa level.
Well, you just hit it on the next topic, which is that trifectas are more common than ever before. And so are united legislative chambers, you might say. Oftentimes the focus is on Congress, and people will say, well, we want to have a divided Congress. We want Senate controlled by one party and the House controlled by another. That's kind of been a prevailing sort of political thought for a long time. But in the state legislatures, we're now at the point where, like you're saying, that there aren't any divided chambers anymore. There used to be a lot more, and there are a lot more trifectas now than ever before, right?
Yeah, so I think Minnesota was the last divided legislature there was, that went Democratic in 2022, so we don't have any more of those. But yeah, so I looked, and as far back as 2002, which sounds like it wasn't that long ago, but it was somehow 22 years ago at the same time.
Yeah.
There were 30 states with divided governments. And the big change came around the 2010 midterms. People remember there was the red wave in Obama's first midterm. And that one ended up with 22 Republican trifectas, 11 Democratic ones, and then 17 divided governments. And so the numbers have changed a little bit over time, but there are definitely less and less divided governments as we go along.
That's amazing. So in 2002, 30 states had divided governments. I mean, it's you see this as well at the presidential election today, where, most analysts would say there's 6 or 7 states that will decide the presidential election, and the other 43 are just kind of get ignored because they're a definitive D or a definitive R. And so you kind of see the same thing with trifectas then, where one party is controlling those governments, those states, and the minority party is, well, they're just doing what they can. That's been quite a flip over the years. So how often do trifectas change? So obviously we've seen a great deal of increases in the number of trifectas in general, but how often do trifectas get broken? How often do we see divided governments, move to trifectas? Do they ever, do we see states that flip between D trifecta to R trifecta to divided? I mean, what's been the status of, we've been tracking this pretty close since 2010. What have we seen over that time period?
Yeah, so since then we've tracked 80 total changes, which over 12 years is 6-ish a year. And there's obviously some spike years and some not so spike years. Most recent one was Louisiana in 2023. That changed from divided to Republican trifecta with the gubernatorial election there. And then the most recent other even year was 2022. And in that one, Democrats gained 4 trifectas. They lost 1 to a divided government. And then Republicans also lost 1 to divided government. So, I would say the trend is more towards divided governments becoming trifectas, because there's usually like, we can use Arizona as an example, even though they don't have a gubernatorial election this year, but they have a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. And so that one, Republicans are really focused on winning the one election to flip it. Whereas for Democrats, they're having to win several down ballot races to kind of change that to a trifecta in their favor.
Yeah. Yeah. All those long-term impacts, those elections. So let's talk a little about our report. The report we recently published, and we've published these for almost a decade now, where we specifically are trying to identify where states might see a new trifecta and where states might lose a trifecta. So we call it our trifecta vulnerability report, meaning it's vulnerable to becoming one or it's vulnerable to losing one. So tell us a little bit about what's the methodology that we have behind that, because it's we've used the same methodology for several years to try to keep it very consistent. So how does it all work? How do we put that together?
Yes, I think just one thing to clarify before we get into it is I don't want people to confuse these for like what would be more traditional race ratings, like some outlets do, where it's like toss up or like lean dem or those sorts of things. So that's not really what this report is. This report is mostly saying like, hey, based on like raw math numbers and what we've seen traditionally over time, like how many seats tend to change year over year, like this number means that it's technically possible for it to change. And so like our best case scenarios for both parties on the analysis report kind of reflect that, where you'll see some like best case Republican scenario for Washington is Republican trifecta, which it might not sound realistic, but is a thing that could like theoretically happen. But vulnerable in general, as it comes to the report, just means there's some chance that the state's trifecta status could change. We put varying degrees of vulnerability in there, which I know we'll get to in a little bit. Because, at a base level, there's states like Hawaii where they have, I want to say 2 Republican state senators in their entire chamber. And there's 12 seats up. So they would need to win something like 11 of the 12 seats up to get a majority. And that's just not realistic. So we don't consider them vulnerable. But there are varying degrees, basically from that point up on the vulnerability scale that we use for the report.
Yep. Yeah. So we see current trifecta status at stake in 44 states. And we use this vulnerability scale to evaluate them. So what's this rating scale that we use? There's points, there's zeros, ones, twos, threes, fours. What are those various buckets and criteria we use to get at the ratings?
Yeah, so for each of the office types, that's governor, state senate, and state house, we assign it points on a 0 to 2 scale based on whether or not it could realistically change party hands. So for gubernatorial elections, it's pretty straightforward. We just take the aggregated race ratings from like Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, some of the other folks we had on this program before. And we just look and say, okay, if it's toss up, it gets 2 points. If it's lean, it gets 1 point. And if it's safe, it gets 0 points. For state legislative elections, it's a little bit different. This is where we just work with the raw numbers and we say, okay, if one party needs X number of seats to change hands to get a majority, we take that, divide it by how many seats are up, and get a percentage. And so based on that, we give them the 0 through 2. And then so if a state scores 5 or 6, we consider it highly vulnerable. 3 to 4 is moderately vulnerable. And then 1 to 2 is somewhat vulnerable. And 0 is like not at all. Mm-hmm. And so that's if the state has all 3 things up for election. If they don't, we kind of scale it down from there. So like if it's just the state legislature, highly vulnerable becomes 3 to 4, and it goes kind of down and on from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we know from covering these elections for more than a decade now that there really are very few seats that change hands every year. I think the most incumbents to be defeated in a general election was something like a little more than 500 in 2010. But we're talking about 500 out of 6,500 that are up for election every year. So the percentage of incumbents who lose is very, very small. So the likelihood of seats flipping is very small, which is one of the reasons why we factor in the raw number of seats that are up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the ones that we have highly vulnerable right now. What are we seeing this year? What are the states that, according to our formula, according to this report, would be considered highly vulnerable for the Republicans, for the Democrats?
Right. So for Democrats on our report, we have Oregon marked as highly vulnerable. I know it has a reputation, especially in the media, as like a very deep blue state, but its legislature is relatively close. So this is highly vulnerable because in the Senate, Democrats have a 5-seat majority. And based on how many seats are up, that's basically like below our threshold to be a 2-point vulnerability. And kind of the same thing in the House, but just a little bit less. So they have a 9-seat majority there. So yeah, that's kind of how we came to Oregon. In terms of Texas and New Hampshire, New Hampshire has a gubernatorial election that's a toss-up. So that one is up in the air, and Republicans hold that one right now.
Yeah.
And then they've got a 14-10 majority in their state Senate. So that's a really small number of seats needed to flip to change that one. And you know the New Hampshire House as well as I do. It kind of throws all the usual logic of a state legislature out the window. It's got 400 seats. I think the Republican majority is down to like 5 right now or 4 right now. And that one just changes so often. Like it feels, I know it's not every 2 years, but it feels like it's every 2 years that it changes. You know, it'll just swing wildly, just kind of.
Well, New Hampshire is one of the states that has actually gone D-trifecta, divided, and R-trifecta in the last 20 years. I think Maine is like that as well. So there are states like Utah and Hawaii that have been single-party rule for 20 years. Then there are states like New Hampshire and Maine that kind of cycle to cycle, voters might go one way or the other. And again, just to sort of repeat something that we've said on the show already, these are not predictions. This is not us saying we think that one of the states is going to change. This is just sort of looking at the math, what could happen if a handful of seats flipped. And Oregon, again, to your point, there was a time where it was a Republican-controlled Senate not too long ago. So yeah, there's the sort of national sense of the state, and then there's what happens down at the statewide level.
Yeah, and Texas is kind of the mirror of Oregon, but in the other direction. So they don't have the gubernatorial election, and then they've got Republican legislatures, but they're not as big of a majority as like you would think. It's just like some cultural knowledge you picked up from the news media.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think in 2010, it was something like a 3-seat majority for Republicans at the time, something like 77 to 74, some number like that, heading into the 2010 election. So again, not so long ago, a state like Texas was pretty close. And whenever you have only... Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, sorry. One other thing to consider with Oregon, too, is this is an interesting election year. I don't know if it's been touched on this program, but they had all of those legislative walkouts over the last, 2 sessions.
That's right.
And so a bunch of the Republican senators aren't allowed to run for re-election because they missed too many legislative days.
And that's actually a great piece of context that relates to, the way that we approach this trifecta vulnerability report. Technically, if we included some of the subjective information like that, it would probably weaken the vulnerability of a state like Oregon, because incumbents are more likely to win re-election. We see that every cycle. And if in Oregon, a larger percentage of Republican incumbents than usual are not running, then it makes it even less likely that they would win more seats to flip. But again, the report that we're doing and what we're putting in, it's just sort of it's an objective, numbers-based report that's just meant to provide information to understand the landscape of what seats are up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk a little about the more secure trifecta. So Democrats have 6 more, with 3 being moderately vulnerable, and another 3 that we are flagging as somewhat vulnerable in the report, which means the change is less likely. So what are you seeing in these states?
Yeah, so in all of those 6 states, it's all down to the legislative elections. So Minnesota, Michigan, and Maine have pretty narrow Democratic majorities in at least one of the chambers. Not included in the report, but something else to consider is Minnesota only has House elections this year, but they have one special election for their state Senate that's going to be at the same time.
Yeah.
And that one's going to determine control of that chamber too. So that didn't make it into the report. If it did, we'd probably bump it up a notch on the vulnerability scale. But that's just something for listeners to know about.
Yeah, and a couple of those states, like Michigan, is one where that chamber flipped in the last election. So,
yeah,
what we often look for in state legislative elections is, cycle to cycle, when one chamber flips, what happens in the next cycle? Are voters happy with the newly elected new party that's in power, in which case they end up maybe growing their majority? Or do you come back and see voters say, we didn't really like what we actually picked last time around, we're going to flip back again? Yeah, and we see that nationally.
Yeah, Michigan and Minnesota are actually great examples of what we talked about earlier with like what is the outcome of a trifecta, like a change. And if people have been listening to stuff in like Michigan, they passed a bunch of legislation with a new Democratic trifecta. And then since he's been in the news a lot lately, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, they passed things like universal school lunch that they hadn't been able to pass before, and some other policy issues that they've been working on just with one vote majority trifectas.
Yeah, all this stuff really matters. My favorite story lately that it has been out of Arizona. Listeners of this podcast know that we talk a lot about ballot measures. And in Arizona, they have more than a dozen legislatively referred ballot measures this year. And this is politics playing out over the long term. The reason why they have a dozen legislatively referred ballot measures in Arizona this year is precisely because in 2022, they lost their Republican trifecta status. Because the Democratic Party won the governorship in Arizona in 2022, that meant that they had veto authority over bills from the Republican legislature. Well, in Arizona, like in most states, the state legislature can refer things to the ballot without the governor's signature. So if the state legislature says, we've got a bunch of bills we want to pass, but we can't get the governor to sign them, now instead they're going to refer them to the ballot and put them before voters. So you could kind of make the case that if Republicans had won the governorship in 2022, you probably would have seen maybe 2 ballot measures this year in Arizona instead of 12. So these are the kind of like really long-term stories that play out with respect to elections and why all this stuff matters with trifectas. So it's always interesting. So let's talk a little bit, Joel, then about the Republican vulnerable, moderate, and sort of slightly moderate trifecta. So what are we seeing over there in places like Georgia and Iowa?
Yeah, so those two are on our list primarily down to how many seats. It's just a math problem. So it's how many seats are up and how many of those Democrats would need to win. In Georgia, they're pretty small numbers. In Iowa, the House is a pretty small number, but then the Iowa Senate, Democrats need to win I think almost half the seats that are up for election. So that one isn't very vulnerable, but that put it on our list anyway.
Yeah. And again, the downstream impact of, the coattails, the presidential election is going to matter with all this. We've got still a long way to go in this election. So who knows?
It wasn't, but 8 years ago that a Democrat won Iowa 2 presidential elections in a row. So there's always, anything can happen.
Yeah. Although there's quite a bit less split ticket voting than there used to be, which, to your point earlier about the number of divided governments versus trifectas today. So overall, the vast majority of Republican trifectas are not rated as vulnerable. So 19 of them. Is there anything to make of that? What do you see in terms of the stability, I guess you might say, of trifectas right now? Because it doesn't seem like, maybe there will be fewer than 40, maybe there'll be 35, but like it's not like we're seeing 15 trifectas might get broken up this cycle. We'd be pretty surprised by it, I think, if that happened. So, but what's kind of the observation of the data there?
Yeah, so because we use the mathematic formulas for state legislatures and because we use the race ratings for gubernatorial elections, those probably aren't going to change at all in terms of the report and like our vulnerability ratings. There was some speculation over whether I think it was a former U.S. senator from Indiana could jump into that gubernatorial election, and he didn't. So that could have changed things. Or I think Joe Manchin can still technically file the run for governor of West Virginia if he wanted to. as an independent, that would shake things up for that vulnerability maybe. Yeah, I would say anything that's listed as not vulnerable at this point is pretty much that's what it's going to be.
Yeah. Okay, so 40 trifectas. I guess there's theoretically a world in which there are 49 trifectas. I mean, there's a roadmap where someone could like plug in, sort of scenarios and get there. So we're seeing of the divided governments, technically 9 of them could become trifectas one way or the other. So what does the data look like in terms of the status and state of divided governments?
Yeah, so I would have to double check our report that I don't have open right now, but I think pretty much everything but Virginia, which doesn't hold even year elections, is like on the table pretty much. Yeah. So on our list, if I was ranking them, I would say Alaska is probably the most likely of any of them to be a trifecta. Republicans have the governorship and it's not up for election. And they actually hold numerical majorities in both legislative chambers, but over the last, I think it's 4 years now, there's been it comes and goes kind of in waves, but there's a power sharing agreement between like some number of Republicans and then all the Democrats and independents in both of those chambers to have like a bipartisan coalition. And so we don't count them as a Republican trifecta, even though they have the numbers for it. So they would have to do kind of what happened in the New York Senate a couple cycles ago, where the Democrats eventually won enough seats to like get rid of the people they were working with on the Republican side. And have like an outright majority. So, Republicans would need to do that in Alaska, but that one I think is the most likely. And then North Carolina and Vermont are the other 2 that we've got our eyes on. So North Carolina's gubernatorial race is a toss-up and Democrats hold it. And the Republicans have veto-proof supermajorities in both chambers of the legislature. So if Republicans win that gubernatorial election and hold on to their majority, they could get a trifecta there. And then Vermont is kind of a mirror of that in the other direction. So they've got a Republican governor, and that's a toss-up election. And then Democrats have majorities in the legislature. So they're trying to just win that gubernatorial election to get the trifecta there.
Yeah. Yeah. Trifectas, it's always a really interesting climate and landscape to follow because the results of these elections, really they dictate what's going to happen in the upcoming spring sessions. Well, great. Trifectas. We'll be writing about these throughout the rest of the upcoming fall. How do folks follow along with our trifecta work on Ballotpedia, Joel? Where can they go to read more about this?
Yeah, so we've got our page just called State Government Trifectas. That's probably the best resource for it. It's got links to all of our historical content, all of our new this year sort of content. And then as the election gets closer, we'll be launching all of our analysis projects for that, one of which is Trifectas. We'll have a page that's updated pretty much every time there's a race call on election night. As soon as an office is called for a Trifecta, we'll update that. And then obviously if stuff changes throughout the year, like if a governor wants to suddenly switch political parties, we'll update that too, and update all of our Trifecta coverage that folks can check out.
Awesome. Joel, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our Trifecta coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening.